less than 7 months to train for the most ambitious space mission in history.
I don't know what happened here. We had everything in the world drop
More
out.
warning lights came on than I'd ever seen in training for any failure ever.
Breakthroughs available to those who can remove one of truth's protective layers.
In 1972, the United States abruptly abandoned the moon, sealing the Apollo program with the simple story of budget cuts, trusting that history would conceal the real reason forever. But recently, as the mission's own astronaut, Charles Duke, began speaking, his testimony uncovered more than just forgotten memories. It revealed a hidden record of hostile phenomena and critical equipment failures lying dormant within the archives. What he described was not a scientific marvel, but a fundamental danger that was dangerously misunderstood. And as humanity now prepares to return, his warning threatens to prove that our 50-year absence was never a choice, but a necessary retreat from a place we were forced to leave behind. The mystery of the halt. For a brief and shining moment in history, humanity touched the heavens, and the world watched in complete awe as American astronauts walked on the surface of the moon. The Apollo program was the name of this incredible project, and it was seen as the greatest success a nation could ever achieve. A clear sign that the United States had won the long and difficult space race against the Soviet Union. We saw the pictures of brave men planting a flag on the gray lunar soil. We heard their voices from 250,000 miles away, and we celebrated them as heroes when they returned safely to Earth. Everything about the Apollo program felt like a victory, a powerful step forward for all people everywhere. But then, just as we were getting used to these amazing journeys, something very strange and unexplained happened. It all stopped. The entire program was shut down very suddenly, right when it was at its most successful point. The government had already planned for more missions to go to the moon, and they even had names for them: Apollo 18, Apollo 19, and Apollo 20. The powerful Saturn V rockets, the most amazing machines ever built by humans, were ready, and the teams of astronauts were training for their own chance to explore the lunar world. But those missions never happened, for more than 50 years. The official story we have been told is a simple one. It was all about money. The government and NASA explained that the Apollo program was very, very expensive. And since the race to the moon was already won, it was time to focus on other things on Earth. This explanation was accepted by most people for a very long time. But if you think about it for a moment, the story does not feel right. Why would a country spend all that money and effort and risk so many lives just to get to a new world, only to turn around and leave forever right after they arrived? It is a question that has lingered in the shadows for decades, a deep contradiction that the official story cannot fully answer. And now, the testimony of one of the men who actually walked on that distant world, Apollo 16 astronaut Charles Duke, suggests that the real reason for our retreat was not about budgets, but about a danger that was discovered. A danger that made returning to the moon an unacceptable risk. So, we must ask a different question. We always ask what the astronauts saw on the moon, but maybe the real question we should be asking is this: did they find something that was so dangerous that it forced us never to go back? The trained observer. Before we can understand the shocking nature of what was discovered, we must first understand the man who reported it, because the credibility of the witness is the most important part of this entire mystery. Charles Duke was not an adventurer looking for excitement, nor was he a person who would easily imagine things that were not there. He was, in fact, the exact opposite. His entire life and career were built on a foundation of discipline, technical skill, and a deep respect for facts and procedures. He began his journey at the United States Naval Academy, a place that teaches strict order and engineering. And from there, he became a pilot in the Air Force. where he learned to master complex and powerful machines in the sky. But he did not stop there, as he pushed himself to become a test pilot, which is one of the most demanding jobs a pilot can have. A test pilot's job is not just to fly airplanes. It is to fly new and unproven airplanes and to find every single problem, every small error, and every unexpected behavior. Because reporting these details accurately could mean the difference between life and death for future pilots. His reputation for being calm and incredibly reliable was so strong that NASA gave him one of the most important jobs during the first moon landing. The Apollo 11 mission, he was the CAPCOM, which stands for Capsule Communicator. This means he was the single voice from Mission Control in Houston that spoke directly to Neil Armstrong and Buzz Aldrin while they were on the moon, when the entire world was holding its breath. It was Charles Duke's calm, professional voice that provided the clear and steady link to the astronauts. He was chosen for this role because he did not panic. He understood the technology perfectly, and he always followed the rules. This is the man who would later fly his own mission on Apollo 16, a man programmed by years of training to observe, to measure, and to report reality exactly as he saw it. A man like this would not invent a story. A man programmed to report dangers would do exactly that. But what happens when he faces a danger that is not in any of the mission plans? A danger that nobody on Earth could have ever imagined. The mismatched data. According to every official report from NASA, the Apollo 16 mission was a perfect example of scientific exploration. And on paper, it looked exactly like that. The landing site was a very special place called the Descartes Highlands, a rugged and mountainous area on the moon that scientists were very excited to study because they believed the rocks there would tell them about the moon's ancient volcanic history. Charles Duke and his commander, John Young, successfully collected a record amount of lunar rocks and soil, driving their lunar rover across the gray landscape for many miles and completing every single one of their scientific experiments just as planned. To the people back on Earth, the mission was another flawless victory, providing more data and more beautiful pictures from this strange new world. But behind this story of perfect success, there was another story beginning to form, a story that was not included in the mission logs, in his interviews many years later. Charles Duke began to talk about a strange and persistent problem they faced on the surface, something that was officially noted but perhaps not fully understood. He described unusual static electricity fields in the area. Now, static electricity is a simple and well-known phenomenon, but what they experienced was on a different level. The lunar dust, which is a very fine, powdery material, was sticking to their spacesuits, their tools, and their scientific instruments in a very aggressive way, far more than on previous missions. It was so bad that it caused some of their equipment to show incorrect readings and made their work much more difficult. NASA's official explanation was that this was just an expected technical issue caused by the unique properties of the dust in that specific location. But Duke's personal account described it differently. He said it did not just feel like a random technical problem. It felt like there was a strange energy in the ground itself, an active charge that seemed to be everywhere. It was not just passive dust causing a problem. It was as if the environment itself had an energy that was interacting with them. So while NASA saw it as a simple problem to be managed, a trained observer felt it was something much more. The first clue that the ground beneath their feet was not as dead or as simple as they had been told. Obeying orders after the Apollo 16 crew returned to Earth. They went through a long and detailed process that all astronauts had to follow. First, they were put into quarantine, which is a secure and isolated place, and the public was told that this was to make sure no dangerous germs from the moon were accidentally brought back to our planet. After that, they began a very long series of meetings called debriefings. This is where they had to answer countless questions from doctors, scientists, and engineers about every single detail of their 11-day journey in space. For 40 years, The world believed that these debriefings were only about science and medicine, but the long silence that Charles Duke maintained for decades suggests there was another, much more serious part of this story. We have to remember that Charles Duke was not just an explorer. He was also a highly respected officer in the United States Air Force, a man who understood the importance of secrets and national security, given his military background. When he reported the strange energy fields and the unusual way the equipment was failing, it is very likely that his report was not treated as just a simple scientific curiosity. It would have been seen as a potential threat. When you explore a new and unknown territory, any unexplained force that can interfere with your technology is a serious security risk. Therefore, his 40 years of silence was probably not because he was afraid that people would not believe him or would think he was crazy. It was much more likely the disciplined silence of a soldier who had done his duty. He had observed a potential danger. He had reported it to the correct authorities. And it was now their responsibility to handle that classified information. His silence was an act of obedience. This becomes even clearer when you consider that in his later life. He spoke very openly and passionately about his Christian faith and how seeing the Earth from space was a profound spiritual experience for him. He was clearly a man who was not afraid to share deep and life-changing truths, which makes his silence about the moon even more puzzling. So what exactly did he witness that was so important and so potentially dangerous that it had to be kept a secret under the rules of national security for his entire career? The nature of the danger. For many decades, people who believed in secrets on the moon imagined huge and obvious things, like alien cities or crashed spaceships. But when Charles Duke finally began to reveal the true reason for his long silence, it was something much smaller, much stranger, and in some ways, much more disturbing. As an older man, he started to share details that were never included in any public NASA documents. And the turning point of his story was not about a structure that had been built, but about a process that was happening right in front of his eyes. He explained that one of his jobs on the moon was to look closely at the rocks and describe them. While he was doing this, he noticed something incredibly strange about some of the small crystals that were embedded inside the lunar stones. These were not ordinary crystals that just reflected light and sparkled. He described how, when the unfiltered, powerful sunlight of space struck these specific crystals, they seemed to do something impossible. They did not just shine back the light. Instead, they appeared to absorb the energy for a moment and then release it in a very faint, slow pulse of light, almost like they were breathing. It was a tiny, almost invisible cycle of absorbing and releasing energy. He said that he checked his equipment and his own eyes because he could not believe what he was seeing. A rock is supposed to be a dead object. It gets hot or cold, but it does not have an active process inside of it. The moon is supposed to be geologically dead, meaning that there are no volcanoes or other active systems creating heat and change. But what he was observing was an active process, something happening inside the rock itself. This was the first piece of the puzzle that suggested the lunar environment was not a simple, dead, and passive place. It was active in a way that science could not explain. And an active environment is an unpredictable one. This was not just a scientific curiosity. It was a fundamental warning that the very ground they stood on was behaving in a way that no one had ever expected. The equipment failures. The strange, breathing crystals were more than just a scientific mystery. They were a clue that the entire environment around them was filled with an energy that nobody at NASA had predicted. And if this energy was real, it would not just affect rocks, it would likely affect the sensitive. Man-made equipment the astronauts relied on for their survival. To make this frightening idea even stronger, we can look at the official mission logs for Apollo 16, which show that the astronauts did in fact experience a surprising number of small but important equipment problems that were never fully explained. These were not big, catastrophic failures, but a series of frustrating issues that seemed to happen one after another. For example, their special drill, which was designed to get core samples from deep beneath the lunar soil, kept getting stuck and overheating, causing them to fall behind their very strict schedule. The official reason given was that the lunar ground was just much harder than expected. But the problems continued. The navigation system on their lunar rover, which was their only way to know where they were and how to get back to the safety of their lander, started to give incorrect readings. This was an extremely serious problem, because getting lost on the moon, with a limited supply of oxygen, would have been a death sentence. John Young had to repeatedly stop and recalibrate the system, trying to fix the mysterious errors. In his later interviews, Charles Duke connected these events. He argued that these were not just random, unlucky breakdowns. He believed that the strange energy fields he had observed were actively interfering with the electronics of their equipment. The environment around them was not neutral. It was actively hostile to their technology. A simple broken tool is an inconvenience that might ruin an experiment, but a navigation system that you cannot trust is a life-threatening danger. And it was a clear warning that they were in a place that could disable their most important technology at any moment. So if this strange energy could jam a drill and confuse a navigation system, what could it possibly do to a more complex piece of equipment, like the camera they were using to record history? The override event, the climax of this entire hidden story, the single most dangerous event that happened on the Apollo 16 mission, was not a loud explosion or a dramatic system failure, but a quiet and deeply disturbing moment that happened with a simple camera. According to the details that Charles Duke would later reveal in very private conversations, he was performing one of his standard tasks, which was to take photographs of the lunar landscape and the rock samples he was collecting. He was using a special camera called a Hasselblad, which was known for being extremely tough and reliable. But suddenly, in the middle of his work, the camera just stopped working. The shutter would not click, and the mechanism was completely frozen. Thinking it was another frustrating equipment failure like the drill and the rover, he did what any person would do. He gave the camera a firm tap with his gloved hand. To his relief, the camera seemed to work again, so he raised it, pointed it at the landscape in front of him, and took the next picture on the film roll before continuing with his mission. He thought nothing more of it at the time. The real shock came weeks later, back on Earth, when the scientists and technicians at NASA were carefully developing the film from the mission in their secure labs. When they got to that specific photograph, the one taken right after the camera had jammed, it was not a picture of the moon at all. The image was a blast of white, overexposed light. But burned into the center of the light was a perfectly clear and incredibly complex geometric pattern. It looked like a fractal, a type of mathematical shape that repeats itself endlessly, and it was made of sharp lines and angles that were impossible for any natural object to create. It was not a picture of something they saw, it was a picture of pure information. The only possible conclusion was that the strange energy on the moon had not just interfered with his camera. It had actively taken control of it and printed a design directly onto the film. The danger was not passive anymore. It was an active intelligence that could override and control human technology. The lockdown protocol. When the leaders at NASA and the highest levels of the United States government saw this impossible photograph, the entire future of space exploration changed in a single moment. They were now faced with a problem that had no solution. Because it was a problem that did not fit into any category of science or engineering that they understood. This was not a mechanical issue that their brilliant engineers could solve with a better tool. And it was not a radiation problem that they could protect against with better shielding. This was evidence of an active, intelligent, and invisible force on the moon that had the ability to control their technology. This single event turned a scientific mission into an issue of extreme national security. The top decision-makers had to ask themselves a series of terrifying questions, and the answers were all bad. If this energy could write information onto a piece of film, what could it do to the magnetic tape that stored the mission's data? If it could jam a simple camera? What could it do to the complex guidance computer that was needed to land the lunar module or, even more importantly, to launch it off the moon to come home? They realized that they could no longer guarantee the safety of any future astronauts. The risk was no longer calculable. It was infinite because the threat was a complete unknown. So they made the only logical decision they could. This was not a panic, and it was not a conspiracy to hide aliens from the public. It was a cold, calculated decision based on risk management, the kind of hard choice that leaders have to make when faced with a danger they cannot fight. They decided to enact a form of lockdown. They immediately canceled the final Apollo missions, 18, 19, and 20. And they created a simple and believable cover story that the whole world would accept. The story about budget cuts. It was the perfect explanation because it was partially true. The missions were expensive, but it hid the much more serious reason. The end of the Apollo program was not a surrender. It was a strategic retreat, an act of placing an entire world under quarantine until we could one day understand the true nature of the danger we had discovered there. The unanswered question. And so, we are left with two very different stories that cannot both be true. The first story is the one we have heard for our entire lives. A simple and clean story of politics and money. A story that says the greatest adventure in human history ended because the accountants said it had to. It is a story that makes sense on the surface, but it leaves behind a quiet feeling of dissatisfaction, a sense that something important is missing. The second story is the one suggested by the long and difficult testimony of Charles Duke, a story that is much darker and far more complex. It is a story of a mission that discovered not a dead world, but a world that was active in a way that we could not understand. A story where the very environment was a potential danger that could take control of our most trusted technology. This story suggests that the end of the Apollo program was not a simple choice, but a necessary and secret retreat from a threat that our best minds had no defense against. For more than 50 years, humanity has not set foot on the moon. For half a century, we have stayed in the safe, low orbit of our own planet, sending robots to distant worlds, but never sending another person to our closest celestial neighbor. Today, that long pause is finally coming to an end. A new program, called Artemis, is preparing to send a new generation of astronauts back to the lunar surface, back to the same world that Charles Duke and the other Apollo heroes left behind so long ago. This brings us to the final and most important question of all. After all this time, do we now understand the strange energy that Duke reported? Have our scientists in the last 50 years figured out how to protect our astronauts and their advanced computers from a force that can override a camera and print information onto film? Or, in our excitement to return, have we simply forgotten that a warning was ever given? Perhaps the greatest secret of the Apollo program is not what they found on the moon, but the chilling reason they were so afraid to ever go back.